You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Daphne Zohar, and my co-hosts today are Josh Schimmer, Brian Skorney, Brad Loncar, Paul Matteis, Sam Fazeli, and Matt Gline. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. We'll start with the top news, and this week, policy and politics are at the forefront. So, yesterday, President Trump sent letters to 17 CEOs of pharma companies, calling on them and all manufacturers to take the following specific actions within 60 days: extend most favored nation pricing to Medicaid, and that's MFN, I'm going to be calling it going forward. Guarantee MFN pricing for newly launched drugs across Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial markets. Repatriate increased revenues from abroad to lower drug prices in the US. Provide for direct purchasing at MFN pricing through a direct-to-consumer model. Of note, the letters do not outline any statutory or regulatory authorities that the administration has to enforce these demands, even though they did say they plan to enforce them. Sam and Brian, we'll start with you. Do you want to comment on this?
Sure. I'll have a go, and then Brian will, I'm sure, add a whole bunch of stuff to it. So, four elements, Daphne, as you quite clearly highlighted. Number one, extend MFN to Medicaid. I think that's going to be a relatively easy lift for pharma because Medicaid prices are some of the lowest, and they should be able to match that. Number four, provide direct purchasing to at MFN pricing, whatever that price ends up being, whatever formula is used for it. Again, pharma companies have already started doing some of this. By all accounts, they should be able to cut prices without really hurting their P&L by 30, 40, 50% in a direct consumer setting, given the sort of rebates that they give away to insurers. Let's say there's a mechanism that can actually happen and they start doing it. It's the two elements in the middle that are a bit of a complication for me. On the one hand, guarantee MFN pricing for newly launched drugs. So that is the MFN story that's been going around for a while now. Let's get new drugs launched at a good price in the US, which is great. The good thing here is it says newly launched drugs. So it sounds like that there is at least an acceptance that it can't retrograde this. So all the products that are on the market would stay at the sort of prices they are. The question then is, what happens if somebody comes with a new GLP-1 and they launch it at a lower price? And then what happens to all the other products that are on the market, for example, up for discussion? And then, of course, the bit that I really can't get my head around is return your increased revenues from outside the US to patients in the US and taxpayers. Well, how are you going to enforce that? And what is the point of MFN if you then do result in increased and the fairness that the administration is looking for, pushing ex-US prices up? What is the incentive in doing that if you're then going to ask for them to send the money back, assuming you had a legal basis to do that? And all of this put together, I'm trying to still understand. On the one hand, you're trying to tell pharma companies to bring their manufacturing footprint into the US, continue to invest in US R&D. At the same time, you want to hit them with reduced profitability. And your argument has always been, you make most of your money here, bring them your drugs over here, sell them over here, make them over here. But at the same time, we don't want to pay for it. That sounds like a not well thought through process. And the last thing I'll say before I pass on to Brian is the goal is set for the September 29. This is getting very close to the next negotiation dates for IRA. Our Washington analyst, Dwayne Wright, believes that in the end, it'll end up being implemented through IRA by just pushing harder on the price negotiations. Brian?
Yeah, that was a great overview, Sam. You know, I think I was on the Regeneron call today, and Len Schleifer, the CEO, was one of the three who were written a letter, and then Trump crossed out their formal title and wrote their first name. And I think Trump missed the ultimate power move to actually just put the wrong names. They should have written Leo, Dan, and Arnold instead of David, Len, and Albert. But look, you know, I think it's funny when Trump kind of laid out MFN, you know, maybe a month and a half ago, and this has obviously been something coming from even his first administration, and IPI, which is the prior iteration. I think conceptually, I don't think it's a terrible idea. I think there are huge disparities between what the U.S. pays for drugs and what other relatively wealthy countries pay for drugs, and I think UK is sort of the prime example of these massive disparities in drug pricing. And I think conceptually it's a good idea to try to find a more common ground, or at least a GDP adjusted common ground between the two prices. I think as Sam, as you highlighted, I think the problem with a lot of kind of the ideas behind the Trump administration that I think superficially are good is just they're kind of so aggressive and not necessarily well thought out. They create much more chaos than sort of like the simple explanation would have. And Regeneron brought up on their call this morning just the fact that they don't make the price of Eylea ex-US, right? They've partnered that out, so they don't really have an ability to do anything other than be forced to pay a much lower Eylea price, because Bayer has no real incentive to raise the ex-US Eylea price, because there's no equilibrium in terms of profitability there. If someone controlled, the worldwide pricing, that's a little bit of a different story. But I think it just kind of signals, and we'll get into this a little more when we talk about the FDA. But there's so many things that are being tried, and maybe a lot of it is in an effort to find better negotiation. But if these are implemented in mass, it's going to create so many disturbances across the sector, and I think that chaos is really what I worry the most about.
Daphne, if I just would add also,
Mhm.
I think we've not been able to find a legal framework through which this could be easily implemented. If the administration decides to go full combat zone on this, then I suspect that Trump will bring all their power to resist it from a legal perspective. And we have a whole bunch of legal brains in our group which tell me that, so I'm just the messenger here. And the other element, of course, is we've just been hearing from these pharma executives how wonderful and productive their conversations with HHS has been with regards to direct to consumer and everything. And then they wake up and get this letter. So, I mean, I don't know if the right hand is aware of what the left hand's doing or not, or whether this is just something we're going to have to get used to and cope with. But we don't see a resolution of this that easily, except couple of points that we talked about, Medicaid and the direct consumer.
Well, there's bipartisan support for drug reform and meaningful drug reform. So if the industry or those companies that were called out want to dig in their heels and fight back, I think that was kind of the point that Trump was making in the letter, which is play ball with us, because if you don't play ball with us, it's going to be potentially much uglier for the sector. And then, of course, in the background, you have China emerging as a lower cost provider of innovation. And so, if you're going to try to force countries around the world to pay a higher price, you're going to have to figure out how to make sure that they're not going to get a better price out of comparable therapies coming from China. So, I think the industry is somewhat lucky that China's not at the stage yet where they were ready to step in as that, across the board, low cost provider of pharmaceuticals. But, China's changing by the minute in terms of their competitiveness. So we'll have to see where this all goes.
Yeah. And China, we're going to come back to China in a little bit. Paul, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think in the backdrop of this, the investment community is still massively discounting this becoming a reality, I think. I mean, when I just look at certain stocks I cover that have big ex-US, US price discrepancies, and what this could actually mean for them. I know Sam was opining on the pharmas, but some of the biotech companies that have concentrated revenues, companies like Vertex or Neurocrine, who, it doesn't have a big ex-US presence, but Ingrezza is sold in Japan. I mean, this could be super, super meaningful. And I still feel like most investors are looking at how tariffs played out, right? Where, the first offer was something that decimated the stock market and was seen as extremely recessionary. And then how it ultimately played out over time, right, was, considerably more benign. So I think that is just at least where the reality is as it relates to how the sector is trading on this. And we'll see if that ends up being right or wrong. But you saw this letter came out yesterday, and yeah, the market was under pressure, but it wasn't at all like day one, the liberation day trading that we saw.
Keep in
Yeah.
mind, though, the nuance that companies are expected to submit their pricing data overseas to the US government. So when you have one company selling a drug in the US and a very different company selling the same drug outside the US, it may be difficult to get that other company to disclose their prices. So there may be some nuances, right, that would pertain perhaps to a Neurocrine in contrast. So much we don't know that we need to better understand if and how this is going to play out. But I don't think many are at this point arguing that this is a good thing, although the offset here is if you can get higher prices ex-US and reasonably protect your US prices, then there's a plausible, perhaps not likely, but plausible scenario that some companies can come out of this ahead.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, Josh, like if this is applied, if there's some sort of negotiation at the end of the day, this is applied to new launches, and there's not that many existing drugs that are getting hit hard. I mean, you could argue that that's bullish for certain drug areas.
Yeah, and I
Can I
think
just
that directionally, just 1 second. So I think directionally, it's where the administration is going, but my sense is that it's not written in stone, and so the investor perspective of let's wait and see how it actually plays out is probably correct. And I spent some time in D.C. with advisors to the administration as well as Dr. Oz. I'm happy to comment on that in a minute, but go ahead, Sam.
can I just postulate a possible future? Let's say the agreement is in place that new drugs will launch at the most favored nation. However, we all know that new drugs almost always launch first in the US. So I'll postulate this, and Josh, you guys can shoot it down or modify it or say it's not possible. I've just got a new drug. I'm bringing it to the US market. The price that we would use in our models would be the average of what we think the drug should get relative to the other drugs that are on the market in the US, plus a premium because it extends survival by 500 years. And therefore, instead of 300,000, now I am in this new world. I've got a new launch. I'm going to price it at 600,000, say, right? And then wait 2 years, which is about the sort of time it takes to get the European launches going, usually, and then launch over there maybe at a slight premium, and then bring it down to a premium to what the history would have been. Then bring it down. In the first 2 years, I've cashed enough in there to make up the difference for the next 3 or 4 years. Does that make any sense to anyone?
It's
I
kind
think
of
what
like
you
the
see
practice in
in
Germany, right?
I think what you see now with high price drugs in the band that you're talking about, it's things like efgartigimod, right? Where the price is actually basically the same in Europe as it is here. And roughly, they've just given up on European access. I mean, like you look at Argenx's sales, such a huge percentage of that's coming from the US. I think when you're talking about that price band, I think that's what most companies will do. I think the tough questions here are for like the GLP manufacturers and things like that, where it's a more complicated situation. The one thing I'd say, just I don't have a lot to add to this conversation, is the honest answer. But the one thing I would say is, I think this whole thing that I hear a lot of, like, we don't know what legal framework the administration could use to accomplish this. I think that represents a fundamental lack of creativity and imagination relative to like what the administration has done to higher ed or what they've done in the tariff sphere or in other places. I think if the administration got really serious about this, they would absolutely be able to find tools to make life unpleasant, including via the regulatory agencies, via FDA and HHS and other places. Like, I think there's a lot of tools the administration has, if they really decide they care about this, to put real pressure.
What's
Yeah.
interesting, and Matt, even in your comments, we kind of focus on Europe when we think about most favored nation. We don't think about China, despite the China prices being a fraction of the European prices. It's an interesting dynamic. I think
That's
we'd
true.
all definitely love to hear what you heard in Washington, though.
That's true. F-Guard is much cheaper in China than it is in Europe. That's absolutely true.
Yeah. So what I heard in general was that the administration is actually looking to collaborate with industry. They want proposals from industry. They are going directionally in this on this path, but they are open to ideas, and they're also open to hearing what's flawed about their proposals. And I found that to be very reassuring. In terms of Oz, who will be involved in the implementation of this, I had a chance to meet with him and hear from him a little bit. And some of the themes that he was commenting on were that CMS really wants to work with industry in a collaborative way. And CMS is really targeting fraud, waste, and in particular, middlemen inefficiencies. So PBMs, 340B, misuse, while ensuring that vulnerable populations access innovative therapies. By the way, one of the ways of enabling MFN would be to eliminate the middlemen in the US, because that doesn't exist. That whole framework doesn't exist in Europe or ex-US. I also heard that CMS is committed to sustaining early stage biotech, and not just CMS, everybody I met in Washington, and CMS in particular through reimbursement clarity and regulatory support. They really want to hear from innovators. And another theme that I heard from everybody I met was a major concern around China and China's IP theft and its threat to US biotech leadership. So this is a big theme for the administration. And I think that this is kind of the bullish piece of it. But we can come back to China, but actually maybe we'll go to China now and then come back to Prasad afterwards. So in terms of, well, yeah, in terms of China, there were some deals, but I think that the key thing on China is that it now accounts for 30% of global clinical trial starts. It's nearly matching the US share, which is 35%. In 2023, China's drug assets represented 24% of the entire global biopharma pipeline, and that's up from just 2% a decade earlier. And most concerning is Chinese companies copying IP and then moving to fast track development. So they're basically able to read about something either in a patent filing or in a publication and then move much faster. They can get multiple companies working and with the regulatory framework, obviously surpass their US counterparts. And that's coupled with pharma companies then going and doing big deals in China with cheap Me Too programs. So as I said, I spent some time in DC also talking to economic advisors to the administration and propose some ideas. I think these are really early, but they seem to be open to them. So one concept would be introducing regulatory reimbursement and funding related penalties to protect US intellectual property. And then another idea or another general theme was around incentives around M&A that only apply to US based biotechs. For example, amending the Internal Revenue Code to allow US based biotech companies to retain their NOLs. So following dilutive financing and M&A transactions, which would make those companies much more attractive. So those are some ideas. I know we're going to come back to the China deal, but anybody want to comment on that before we go to Prasad, which was the other big news of the week?
This is Brad's favorite topic. Come on, Brad. What do you think of those proposals?
On NFM or on the China stuff?
No, on the China, the ones that Daphne just spoke about.
Oh, I think the tax thing should definitely happen. I'm in the minority. I think that something politically big is going to happen with China over the next 2 or 3 years. I don't like the GSK thing and like all of the deals that are happening. Like I don't fault anybody for doing those deals. Like everybody's acting in their own self-interest. But the thing that you have to take a step back and look at is that our industry's relationship with China is the exact opposite of every other industry. Meaning every other industry is outsourcing the stuff that doesn't matter, like the cheap manufacturing. So I always use this analogy. It's that iconic slogan on every Apple product, designed by Apple in California. Nobody cares that iPhones are being made in China because that's not the valuable part of the equation of what Apple is doing. The valuable part is inventing new technologies. Our industry is doing the exact opposite. We are outsourcing the innovation part. The GSK drugs, if they had that label, it would say designed by Hengrui in China. And if you're GSK, you're doing what's in your best interest because they can do R&D. They can get to a phase 1 proof of concept on those drugs literally years faster than they could do themselves doing their own R&D. So I don't fault them for doing what's in their best interest. But if you're a politician And most of the politicians, like our industry is too technical. They don't understand it yet. Like another thing to keep in mind is the semiconductor industry has gone through this, and it took the politicians years to understand the semiconductor industry. Like we're next, and we're even more technical than that. So it's going to take them a little longer to understand our industry. But when the politicians whose job is to think of the long-term like GSK, you would, I mean, obviously it's a, an Anglo-Swedish company, but like their job is not to think of the long-term competitiveness of the United States and like what could happen geopolitically further on down the road. That is the job of a politician. So when the politicians start to understand that we're outsourcing the innovation part, we're outsourcing the science part of what we do, they're going to freak out, and they're going to make changes that's going to make it a lot more difficult to do business with China, just like has happened with the semiconductor industry. So I'm in the more minority on that opinion, but I do think it's inevitable that something happens like that, unless our relationship with China somehow magically got better, and I think the odds of that are practically zero. So I think something big is going to happen on this over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I don't
Can I
think you're
say?
in the minority, Brad. I think you're spot on, and I think it might happen sooner.
Can I say? I think this is a conversation though that I hear all the time, and I agree with a lot of Brad. I think I agree with you on a lot of things about China. But I think that again, I feel like all of this discourse that's like, oh, we're outsourcing the innovative part to China. I think that is just missing a transformation that is happening in front of our noses, which is that this is not the innovative part anymore. Generating 50 CD19 T cell engagers, each one a novel molecule, and generating phase 1 data for 50 T cell engagers, each one a novel molecule. It just turns out that's a commodity good now. We built an industry in the US that was like designed to think of that thing as the innovative thing, and it's not anymore. And I feel like that is an adjustment that we're all going to have to make, because I feel like even if you figured out how to block it from happening between the US and China, it turns out that there will be other, like, it's just not that hard to generate a new T cell engager now. And so people are going to be able to do it. And I just feel
So,
like that change is something that we like need to start reacting to as an industry
But
at
Matt,
some point.
so I agree with that. But what you're describing is what's going on today. Like we are literally by the way, another thing that's important to know about all of this is China is actually on. We talk about China's biotech sector as if it's unstoppable and inevitable. They're on thinner ice than we are, because they are 100% reliant on succeeding in the United States to even have a biotech sector. Like one of the biggest disappointments of the last like 6 or 7 years is how China's pharmaceutical and innovate, like what they pay for drugs, has never materialized. So like they're like, we talk about them as if they're unstoppable, but they're not. Like they're in really thin ice if we make major changes here. But the thing that I would disagree with, Matt, is we are right now what they're doing is like what I would agree with you is not like super innovative like new inventions, but we're basically funding their knowledge, and at the same time we've stopped funding our startups that are working on discovery and early stage science. Like that 30% of deals that's going to Chinese companies, that means it's not going to US companies. And there's companies that don't exist today that like would have existed like like under what like our traditional and like under our traditional way of doing this. So the challenge is that these Chinese companies are going to get, if we keep funding their growth, like if we're like paying for their college like tuition so to speak, like there will absolutely be in a couple of years, if not sooner, a new phase to this where we have funded their knowledge to the point that they are innovating on everything. And the way that the regulatory structure is today and their cost, like you can have 5 people there for every one here. It's just like simple math of like what salaries cost. And same with manufacturing, like everything I always say, like, when it comes to China, everything that we have here, they could have 5 there for the same cost. Like, it's going to be really hard to regulate, like, just make FDA rules looser and say, well, we'll be able to compete hand in hand with them. I don't think so.
Right.
So if we get to a point where, um, anyway, we could talk for hours about this. I'm going to
Yeah.
stop, but this will go to a new phase that
Yeah.
where they're out innovating on things that are truly new, and we do not have the ability to keep up because things are so much cheaper and quicker there that, like, it's impossible to change the regulatory structure here to level that playing field exactly.
Yeah.
Daphne,
Okay.
do you have one more second on this or not? You're the
If
boss.
it's something new, go ahead.
Let me see. Can I provoke and say, cross out China, just as President Trump did on his letters,
Hmm.
and put Europe? If this was Europe, which we would, I don't know, I would love it to be, but it's not. Would we have the same consternations? Would we have the same issues?
Yeah. So I think that the biggest issue is around theft of IP, and if there was a way to tie that to other, for example, regulatory or reimbursement or other aspects, I think that would be a good deterrent. I don't think that's as big of an issue in Europe, and I also don't think they're not doing what China's doing in terms of the speed. But let's move on because we have a lot of topics to cover. And one of the other big news items of the week, of course, was Vinay Prasad, FDA CBER director, stepping down after some controversial decisions, including actually reportedly overruling his reviewers 6 times in about that many weeks. He was only 3 months in the position, which translates into around 8 Scaramucci's for those who follow that. And all eyes are on who will replace him at CBER, with rumors of a potential restructuring at FDA to spin out the vaccines division and combine CBER and CDER. Skorney, you predicted Prasad leaving, so let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I certainly felt the actions that he took and sort of the response, in particular on sort of some on the MAGA side of things, on the Maha side of things, was particularly aggressive. And look, I mean, a lot of us have been following Vinay for the last decade. I mean, he is a person to rock the boat, whether you agree or disagree with him. He is loud and he is pretty forceful with his views. So I just think he tried to do too much too quickly, rock the boat too much, and ultimately that drew the ire of sort of the MAGA Maha crowd and per reporting, maybe Trump himself, and he is gone, and I think it has a lot to do with sort of him coming in and taking aggressive tactics on a number of applications, but most notably is probably his response to the Sarepta controversy with the 2 DMD deaths on Elevidys, a third LGMD death with a related product, and another DMD death on Elevidys from not the same liver toxicity, but a potentially related immunosuppression and resulting in an infection that resulted in a patient's death. So I mean, I think it's a very I think for stocks, given the concerns that industry had over him, in particularly holding programs to a much higher bar than certainly we were used to for Peter Marks, but arguably a bar that we'd never really seen before in industry at the FDA. His removal has been viewed by investors as a net at least near-term positive for stocks, and that a lot of these companies with small data sets, more ambiguous data sets, but in indications that are very tough to develop drugs in, might be given more leniency under an FDA that doesn't have him running CBER and being CMO and CSO.
So was he too lenient with how he handled Sarepta, or was he not lenient enough because of how he's handled Sarepta and a bunch of other applications?
I think it had to do a lot with this inconsistency with his review team. So the idea of overruling your team and also inconsistency with previous guidance. I think that was one angle. The other was political. And actually, I'd love to come to Matt. You mentioned that Doug Ingram has a history of fighting FDA on things and winning. I'm not sure how much Sarepta actually was behind any of this, including the political pushback.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not either. You know, Doug at Allergan was heavily involved in the Botox sort of marketing lawsuits. Obviously, he was involved at Sarepta when Elevidys was first approved and in sort of mobilizing the patient groups then. I guess my honest view is it would be a little bit surprising if you had a coordinated campaign from Laura Loomer, the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, and all the patient advocates and everything else, and it turned out that Sarepta had nothing to do with it. So, especially given his history, I guess like my view from the outside is that I'm not like a conspiracy theorist, but it seems like there's something there, right?
Can I just say, Matt, you know, not to diminish Doug's role in regulatory success, but you know, I would also note Sarepta has managed this
Yeah.
enormous regulatory success through 3 different CEOs, and it's too bad Chris isn't on today because he's one of them, but
Yeah.
Ed Kay and Doug are the other two. And you know, I just wonder, is it the person in that seat that is responsible for this, or is it someone else? Because I would argue that it's more likely organizations like MDA, PPMD, Cure Duchenne. A lot of us could probably even call out specific mothers who have had direct influence on ultimate decision makers within the FDA around DMD drug approvals. And it sounds like that may even be the case to some extent, based on some of the reporting, in this case as well, around the Elevidys reintroduction and even Vinay's ouster. So, you know, I think it's a signal, you know, and this goes for advocacy groups at large, but the DMD advocacy groups are extraordinarily powerful.
But between
I agree.
That's a good point.
between Peter Marks now and Vinay Prasad, who even wants that job?
Yeah, it's a great point.
George does, maybe.
Right. And I think, you know, what I continue to hear from colleagues is still generally positive sentiment about Commissioner Makary. So the 5th FDA listening session with about 60 industry CEOs and senior executives took place in New York right after Prasad left, and George Tidmarsh, the new seater, had joined him on that one. And what Makary talked about was in line with previous sessions around streamlining FDA operations, eliminating redundancies, reducing duplicate testing, regulatory flexibility, kept talking about that, enhancing post-market surveillance through centralized adverse event databases, incentivizing U.S. manufacturing via a gold card, and rejecting certain foreign, e.g. Chinese data, and emphasizing rare disease, placebo-free trials, and more timely agency responses. So, Matt, you were at this one. What did you take away from it?
Yeah, I mean, overall, it was a benign, helpful, favorable session. I think he came across, to your point about the administration generally, I think he came across as open minded. I think he came across as genuinely interested in figuring out ways to make the agency more effective. I think if a third of what he said came to pass, it would be all good for the biotech industry. And I think he came across as serious in the attempt. I think the 2 things that were notable, I mean, Prasad had departed the night before, and the name Prasad was not mentioned in the 3-hour session once, which I thought was like a whatever. It was a notable experience sitting in that room with whatever, it was about 100 people in total, and like it just never came up. I thought that was like interesting. And then the other thing that was interesting is there was a specific discussion around CDER and CBER alignment. And I think he made it pretty clear that a thing that he thinks is useful is getting CDER and CBER much more closely aligned with one another. He had George sitting right there. George had obviously been sort of appointed interim head of CBER in addition to his role as CDER, you know, sort of immediately prior to the session. And I thought that was also an interesting note, especially in light of what had happened and almost whatever, lemonade of lemons, whatever it was, like almost made the sequence seem intentional as a part of bringing the 2 centers closer together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, so we have a few more policy-related things. Sam, quickly on tariffs, and then we'll go to Josh on other drama around RFK.
Yeah, so tariffs, we had the August 1st came, midnight last night. We had the 15% tariff that's been handed out to many countries that weren't, that even did deals. So European Union has got the 15%. At the beginning of it, that was last week, obviously, there was a bit of a to and fro between different groups as to whether pharmaceuticals were included or not. And I think the final bottom line was that pharmaceuticals were included. And then overnight we had the 35%. I can never remember what the exact is because I've also seen 37% mentioned somewhere for Switzerland, which of course impacts Roche and Novartis. But then there was a question as to whether that includes pharmaceuticals or not. Semiconductors don't really matter so much to Switzerland, but pharmaceuticals clearly do. And my understanding is pharmaceuticals are included in the conversation, but whoever wants to correct us online, follow up the conversation, do it. And then of course you've got everything else that's going. So all that's in place. It doesn't hit until next week. So there's still time for these to be corrected. And we'll see how that pans out. And that's where we are with tariffs as regards the overall pharmaceuticals. I don't think there was another element to tariffs to cover, was there, Daphne?
No, I mean, I think an important practical consideration is that most US small to mid-sized biotech companies don't have the capital or capability to move their manufacturing, and many rely on CDMOs. So until there's sufficient and affordable US capacity at CDMOs, it's going to be tough for smaller companies to comply. But 15% is not massive.
Is manageable.
Yeah, it's manageable.
It's manageable. Yeah.
So Josh, you wanted to talk about other RFK drama.
Yeah, look, there's something in the news nearly every week. Now, a couple of news items. One, he wants to restructure the Preventive Health Task Force that makes recommendations for medical screening, apparently viewing them as too woke. Admittedly, they are quite woke. I don't know what too woke means. And he wants it to have fewer doctors and nurses and more dietitians and therapists. And hopefully that will be smoother than what he's done to the ACIP panel, which is still very contentious. And then the other interesting move that he's come out with, not surprisingly, is overhauling the vaccine injury program and wanting vaccine injury victims to be compensated, quote, quickly and fairly, which is obviously going to mean a lot of litigation for his litigation friends. I think it's going to be very difficult, though, to prove vaccine injury. It'll be very interesting to see if this whole do vaccines cause autism. Well, it's not much of a debate. I think most everyone who understands the literature doesn't view so, but it's that fringe view that vaccines are associated with autism. Imagine it making its way into a Supreme Court litigation around vaccine injury. So lots more to come out of HHS.
Yeah, and you guys a few weeks ago talked a lot about these some of the panels, and I think that the experts that they're choosing there's definitely some concern around that. There was also some news yesterday that the Senate Appropriations Committee rejected the administration's proposed funding cut to the NIH, advancing a measure that would increase the budget by about $400 million. I didn't have much time to dig into that, but it seems to be good news for the biotech ecosystem if it plays out. So let's move to some deals. Matt, you wanted to talk about the GSK-Hengrui deal, and then also Josh and Matt to talk about the BMS Bain SpinCo.
Yeah, on GSK-Hengrui, I don't have much to say beyond the conversation we already had on China before. I don't know if
Yeah, so we can move on. So let's go to the BMS Bain SpinCo.
Look, this is this is a deal structure that my company Roivant has a lot of familiarity with. It's what we did with Pfizer with Telavant and Priovant. The thing that I thought was interesting about it, look, other than I think TLR7/8 is a promising class. I think it's a little bit interesting to see it go into this sort of structure. Obviously, lupus is an increasingly crowded indication. The deal that was done, I think people follow along, but Bristol did a deal with Bain where they took a collection of assets. The lead among them is a phase 3 TLR7/8, mostly an SLE, and put it into a SpinCo where Bristol kept about 20% of it. Bain presumably owns the rest and made a $300 million financing commitment along with royalty and milestone obligations back to Bristol. Look, I think this continues to underscore that even as I think Bristol's had a pretty good run relative to where they were, but even as these companies are recovering and figuring things out, they have a lot of P&L pressure. They need to work on their portfolios, and they need to make tough decisions. And look, obviously, I think it's good for all of us, good for the industry if those tough decisions involve creative partnership structures that allow those programs to continue to be developed. So I was happy to see it, and expect we'll see more and more similar things happening from them and from others in the future.
Yeah, and Bain did the Cerevel
Yep.
one, and that was very successful. They've been very successful in that.
Daphne?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just add a couple of things on the GSK-Hengrui? Just a couple.
Okay.
In terms of size, it was the third largest deal in terms of buyer dollars ever. So the biggest one was Daiichi Merck, 22 billion. Recursion and Roche, 12 billion, which was, of course, 40 targets, etc. But I think there's one point we need to bring out here, and that is that GSK has basically bought a whole bunch of options. And what it highlights is that they've given Hengrui or they've taken the right to products that Hengrui takes through phase 1. And at that point, they make a decision. And the exact point that we just talked about was they can do these phase 1s and that early stage development much faster and much cheaper than currently we can. And that's what I think that's what Matt was trying to say too. That's what we need to fix. But what GSK is getting at is good human data, including non-Chinese patients, for a fraction of the cost in the end. Of course, Hengrui's a profit in that, and they get to the option to take that at that point. That's what I think is attracting people there. So, and also it's unfair to say there's no innovation. I mean, PD-1 VEGF bispecifics, where did that come from?
Let me
So
just,
Brad, go
just to
ahead.
that point.
yeah,
Go
let me
ahead,
just
Brad.
very quickly agree with you and just say, think of this deal this way. Like, it really shines a light on what a structural problem this is. Hengrui is not an his GSK has been inventing new medicines for literally over 100 years. Hengrui has been doing that for like 4 years. So the fact that GSK is like, we need to outsource our science to this company. Like, if you'd asked me 4 or 5 years ago, what are the, you know, out of the 50 China biotech companies, like rank them in terms of like the impressiveness of their work, Hengrui would be like in the bottom 5 or 10. Like, it is a traditionally generic drug maker. And so the fact that GSK, which has been at the forefront of science literally for over a century, is like, we need to outsource our science part to these guys, because it's just so much faster and better, I think really goes to show what a structural problem this is, like, clearly. So I think it's a great example of um, of of eventually people are going to pick up on this, and I think it's a glaring example of like what the issue at stake is here.
Yeah, it's a great point. So, Paul, I want to hear a little bit from you. Let's talk about the AbbVie Gilgamesh $1 billion deal rumors. I'm not sure if there's any news on that today. And then also some good launches in biotech and whether shorting the launch is a dead thesis.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the AbbVie Gilgamesh rumors reported by Bloomberg, I think, are interesting because I think if this happens, it reflects, another player that's a mainstream player in the case of AbbVie here and J&J over there going all in on psychedelics, right? And taking a step back, psychedelics kind of emerged on the public market scene maybe 6 or 7 years ago. They had very niche interest from investors. And I think there were some really, really significant commercial questions around the scalability of the model with these drugs. But J&J has seemingly validated that to a degree with Spravato, which looks like it's on its way to being a $2 billion plus drug. And not that long. And Spravato is certainly a nice product, but it's given every other week. And even with that cumbersome dosing paradigm, the utilization is growing really, really fast, right? So AbbVie doing this deal for Gilgamesh, who's a mid-stage player, has some data. We'll see how the data ultimately plays out over time and their differentiation. But it's validating for the space, right? For companies like Compass, GH, MindMed. It's a space we're following closely, and all of these programs have their kind of own sort of idiosyncrasies, their own questions around safety, their own questions around scalability in the real world. But I think Josh mentioned this over the email, right? I mean, Compass now has a phase 3 study in the bag, and they're looking to meet with the FDA soon to see if there's even a path to filing sooner than they expected, right? So I think there's a lot of moving parts here, but ultimately feels like there's broad support politically for these drugs and the medical community for these drugs. And I think the Compass situation is going to be super interesting because the psychiatry division is notoriously, I don't want to say conservative, but like pretty by the book, right? In terms of what they expect for companies. And so Compass having a phase 2 study and a phase 3 and not completing the second phase 3, I mean, traditionally that would just be a non-starter from a filing perspective. But But if it's ever going to change, it could be now, right, in this kind of environment for psychedelics. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything.
Nope. Keep going. Let's talk about launches in biotech, Alnylam, argenx, Neurocrine.
Yeah, sure. I mean, our team was kind of looking back at some of our older models from companies I've covered for, like a decade or longer, and just looking at, what the spend was early days in a launch back then versus now. And I think we're seeing this theme where just small to mid-sized companies are just much more well-resourced and much more sophisticated when they launch drugs. It also feels like they're more sophisticated at managing down expectations. And I thought this week was just interesting, right? Where it looks like it was a second quarter that was pretty good broadly on an industry perspective. But, you saw Alnylam blow out numbers, even in the backdrop of super high expectations for vutrisiran and TTR cardiomyopathy. You've seen Neurocrine with their drug Chronicity in CAH, get over 1,000 patients close to starting therapy. And just a year or two ago, I mean, I think most people thought that was going to be a fairly small product. I mean, there was Verona, Madrigal. I mean, the list sort of goes on here. And it's just like interesting, right? I mean, I think like this is something that might still, I think there's still a lot of impediments to getting generalists in the sector, but I think like short the launch was kind of the cliche, right? And it feels like now that's become just a lot more dangerous for people. And I would even say that in my coverage universe, the commercial stories are, more and more in favor versus how they've been historically, where I feel like kind of the better way to play biotech was to do, clin dev stories and kind of dream the dream. But once a company launches the drug, the financial reality gets a little bit more complicated and challenging to grapple with. And I just think in this year, we've really been seeing the opposite.
Yeah, and Josh, you cover Bridge Bio as well. I saw Neil last week. That's another example, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a different era now. It's an exciting era. I think investors have broadly taken note of it as well. I think for me, what's an interesting theme, though, is looking at some of these companies that are having good product launches, then thinking about what comes next and looking at some of the pipeline programs that aren't really getting a lot of value recognition.
Yeah.
How much of this is due to analysts also thinking, well, look, we've learned from this short the launch, so let's be conservative, and management being more conservative with guidance? Is there any of that?
Or how much does it come from drug prices being like 3 times higher than they used to be? So everything that's multiplied by 3 and we have this ranges. But Sam, to your point, yeah, I mean, there's multifactorial and there have been a lot of adjustments and learnings along the way. I don't think it's all just expectation setting, part of it, but I think there's also operational execution that's changed.
So Brian, and then we have Brian, Paul, and Sam on Alzheimer's news. We have Biogen earnings, some blood-based biomarker stuff, and Lilly A beta prevention. So why don't we start with Brian?
Yeah, so talking about short the launches and when do expectations start actually outperforming? I thought Biogen was interesting this quarter. It was really maybe one of the first quarters I remember where Leqembi actually outpaced expectations. I mean, it wasn't a massive outpacing. I mean, it was a big outpacing if you included a one-time to China, but even if you unwind that one-time build in China, it still did outpace expectations on a revenue side. But what I thought was more interesting commentary, and I think this goes kind of across the class, right? Leqembi has been a really huge disappointment relative to where expectations were maybe 5 years ago for something like an aducanumab. And I do think like a lot of the controversy around the aducanumab approval has sort of weighed on these next anti-amyloid therapies that have been approved. But there's certainly a lot of hurdles to getting patients on therapy. And one of the things that's really been a big hurdle is getting patients diagnosed and with a positive PET confirmation of amyloid presence. And one of the things that has really been interesting is we've seen an emergence of these blood-based biomarkers looking to correlate with amyloid on PET, and they're getting better and better. And we're sort of seeing a lot of usage of blood-based biomarkers right now to sort of go through a decision tree as to whether or not a patient with maybe mild cognitive impairment should go on for a PET or not, and sort of excluding that. And one of the comments that Biogen had was that they've sort of seen the blood-based biomarkers increase threefold over the last year. So I think that's an interesting consideration, and I know Sam has some commentary off of Roche's presentations as well, but I think we're really starting to see the emergence of these much more easy tests, which ultimately may wind up being the primary mode of diagnosing Alzheimer's and getting around PET altogether.
Sam?
Yeah, I mean, there's not really much to add. I mean, that was a preclinical story that came through, and Roche is still sticking its colors to the mast with regards to the trontinemab brain shuttle, etc. So, I agree with Brian that it's been interesting to watch this. I mean, these were a class of drugs that in the end, they didn't really pass muster with regards to the clinical data that I've been seeing. So I think there's quite a lot of that playing out here. But Russia's progress quickly into much earlier stage Alzheimer's is quite telling. And let's not forget that they're also a company that knows all about diagnostics. So I'm hoping that that is a good signal going forward.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add, like, I think at this point, like, if in the absence of any more clinical data, it feels like this could be a slow grind. And, who knows, maybe Leqembi ends up getting to being a couple $1 billion drug someday. But, when we talk to different neurologist practices, right? I mean, I still think the growth here is fairly linear, and it's because of diagnosis, but it's also just because of capacity, right? And Biogen has said over and over that one of the rate limiting features of this launch has been getting people to see a neurologist, which is kind of like conceptually wild, right? So, I think the interesting readout that we're going to get is in sometime likely in the next year, and maybe sooner if we get an interim analysis that's positive, is from this Lilly AHEAD study that people are calling an Alzheimer's prevention trial. The truth is a little bit more equivocal, right? Because these patients are kind of at that sort of early, really tipping point, pre-symptomatic stage. But if that study works, I think there's an argument that for patients who don't actually yet have Alzheimer's, the level of motivation for seeking a treatment to prevent it might be somewhat different than someone who's already somewhat symptomatic and they're being told that the drug is not going to make them any better. And, that patient psychology question is really centers around like the debate on this study. And is this study going to actually really increase the use of these drugs? Could it transform them? Could it just have a marginal impact? But I mean, I guess, Brian, like the one issue we still have with that study and even these blood-based biomarkers when we think about scaling this to a broader population is if you look at the Lilly trial, the screen failure rate is still like 85 to 90%, right? So that shows that like even people who are seeking out this study who think that they could be a candidate, the vast majority of the time that they're not. So I just like wonder if that's really still going to be viable in the real world, and how are we going to implement these tests? Where are they going to be? Are they really going to be in like primary care? Like, and if it all still comes down to referral to a neurologist because of the ARIA monitoring and things like that, like, maybe data that from that study could double the size of this class, but I'm just not sure if it could like 5x it in the way that some investors are starting to kind of talk about, albeit, I think Biogen is still a pretty out of favor stock right now.
So Galapagos, what's happening over there? I know Henry was originally going to run the SpinCo. Now he's running the parent. Matt, you've been following this story.
I have actually talked about it on here before, and I just think it's, again, one of these examples of long-term laws of unintended consequence, where you've got a story that had a very specific meaning under its prior incarnation, and then when Ono left and Filgotinib and the other sort of original compounds kind of blew up, you wound up with this no man's land. And now they've been going through a series of iterations to try and reboot the story. And the thing that happened last week is there was a further modest renegotiation of the Gilead Pact and some team changes there to try and clean things up and maybe make it easier to sell the cell therapy company that was originally going to be spun out and is not going to be spun out. Look, my take on this from the outside remains what it has been, which is there's an awful lot of capital there. There's some smart people around the story as investors and so on, but that until the economic arrangement and framework with Gilead is truly sorted out, you have a box of cash that has some really complicated encumbrances on it. And I think it's going to continue to flap in the breeze a little bit until some of that stuff gets settled. Now, Galapagos has a lot of a lot of say in the matter, because I think most of the complicated entanglements with Gilead have sunsets in the next few years, and so I think we'll see that play out over time.
Great. No, well, we're almost at time, so let's go around. Usually we start the show talking about biotech sentiment, capital markets, et cetera. Let's end the show talking about that. We'll start with Brad.
Well, I would just say, like, I feel like we've all been in like a a bad mood for a long time, and I would just say that, like, if you take a step back, like, things are going really well lately. Like, how many clinical trial results have there been over the last 3 or 4 weeks where we've seen companies literally quadruple or quintuple? And you're talking about Alnylam earlier. I mean, they crossed the $50 billion market cap. That's a major achievement for our industry, and just goes to show that if you have really great science, it doesn't happen overnight, but you can build something that's really big and impressive. And a lot of drug launches are going well. Like, how about Madrigal being in a position to be buying stuff? Their launch is going so well. So I think we're getting caught up on a lot of the cleanup from the COVID bubble, like the stuff that shouldn't exist. And a lot of that's like weighing down the XBI. But I would say, like, especially lately, in the last few months, it feels like the news flow has been pretty good. So I would say, we should be pretty optimistic lately.
Yeah. Josh?
Still a lot of risk out there. The one thing I'd say is that, at least from the investment perspective, you can't rely on the same investment practice or approach, irrespective of the broader context, whether it's macroeconomic or regulatory or China innovation. So I think that's kind of the fun of what we do, is we're always trying to figure out what is the right investment strategy in the moment, and the moment today is different than the moment at the beginning of this year and last year, and it'll continue to evolve.
Brian?
Yeah, I agree a lot with Fred and Josh. One of the things I want to just kind of call back to is the commentary about the drug launch outperformance. And I sort of have this overarching thesis that a big part of the cycles that we go through is sort of how expectations build, right? I mean, and there's this chicken versus the egg argument of, like, do people drive valuations higher, and then by trying to catch up with valuation and to necessitate higher valuation, you just have higher expectations of launches. And then as things sort of blow up and valuations go down, your expectations just go down along with them. And, I think sort of the last big bear market, that there were a lot of regulatory issues, and short launch was just commonly stated a great thesis in sort of late the 2008, 2011 era. And what you saw then is you saw massive outperformances over expectations. You saw launches of drugs like Tecfidera, Eylea, Sovaldi, things that wound up being 3, 4, 5 times bigger than what people were modeling. And I think it was because the sector was so depressed. People were just being really conservative. And I think you see the same things with clinical trial outcomes these days. You see catalysts that can lead to 200, 300, 400% moves because the valuations have been so depressed. So I take that as a positive. Look, the whole sector always trades on risk and reward. And, I think what we're seeing now is the reward relative to valuations has become profoundly higher. Arguably, there's a little more risk, certainly. There's a lot of regulatory concerns, government concerns. But you're seeing some really big upside moves that I think I think should bring interest back to the sector.
Well, the three of you have been consistently, like, I think more not pessimistic, but less optimistic than most. So I find your comments to be really reassuring. Let's go to Paul, Sam, and then Matt. You can close out the room.
Yeah, not much to add. I mean, it feels like the risk on piece is definitely like emerging, right? We're seeing more financings. Stocks have been trading better on data, so not much to add. But outside of this kind of MFN lingering, it feels like the market's in a much more healthy place for the sector.
Okay, Sam, and then Matt's going to close it out.
Yeah, I love hearing this, because at heart I'm a biotech analyst, but we did have the opposite story right this week in Pharmaland with Novo Nordisk cutting its sales growth for the year by a half. 14% down to 7%. That's a launch that's not going as well, but that's because their lunch being eaten by compounders and competition from a very good drug from Lilly. So Pharmaland hasn't been as great this week, but biotech, I'm really excited. And when Josh is happy, I get happy. So I'm waiting to see.
Yeah, thanks. Look, a lot of smart people have gotten to go before me, so I don't have a ton new to say. I think getting away from some of the political turbulence and whatever else that actually feels bizarrely short term, even though maybe it shouldn't to me. It's been so sort of whiplashy. I think there's just like some really exciting fundamental changes happening, right? Biotech companies launching products well because the M&A climate has changed, so they haven't been bought as clinical stage companies. I think it's like a great development. People finding like actual business models. I think it's going to turn out eventually that however the China dynamics play out, that like new parts of the industry are going to be commoditized, and it's going to lead to like interesting developments in other parts of the industry. And I'm just like excited to see that play out. And I think so much of what we're watching is the early or middle stages of some of that transformation. And it's complicated, but it's fun to be part of.
Yeah. Well, thanks all for your great comments today, and hope you have a nice weekend. We'll see everybody next week on Biotech Hangout.